Welcome back. We're going to talk today about another piece of how to build your very own well-fed retirement. The retirement recipes that we go over today are really going to talk about how your retirement needs to be able to adapt and evolve as we have changing economic trends. But before we do want to invite you to check out the Well-Fed Retirement book, Cooking Up a Retirement of Abundance. It will go much deeper into the A to Z process of getting yourself ready and out the door. But today, we're going to focus in on a couple very specific pieces. And in that, we need to pay attention as we get ready for retirement because this is a very unique time. The changing economic trends. First and foremost, we're talking about national debt. We have a historic level of national debt now crossing over $30 trillion. We also need to talk about demographics and the impact of a population that is aging and no longer growing. It was a pyramid and has now become more of a diamond. How does that impact things? Also, we'll need to talk about a new topic, a newer topic in terms of its impact on retirement, and that's inflation. For the last 40 years, we haven't seen anything near the inflation we are seeing here in 2022. And then we also want to talk about how that impacts interest rates and how that comes full circle to impact your retirement. So first, let's go into the macro here and talk just a little bit about what has gone on here in recent history. So as part of the pandemic, businesses had to shut down, and what was being produced in that time? Money. It was stimulus spending that allowed us to bridge the gap, so to speak, and it came at the impact of our deficit and our debt increasing. So what does that mean? It was debt-financed stimulus. We were borrowing from future Americans to help current Americans through a difficult time. So there was $6.68 trillion of stimulus, but let's look first at the trajectory we were on before the pandemic. What you'll see here is that our deficits continued to grow. The amount we were spending was increasing relative to the tax revenue, and you can see here that in 2019 we spent $1 trillion more than we raised, and that was while things were still relatively peaceful, calm, and happy, healthy, right? So there wasn't a pandemic. And then you can see here in 2020 we had that stimulus. Guys, 30% of all US dollars ever printed were printed in 2020. That has massive reverberations. So let's see, where did that money go? Where is the money currently being spent? Well, our largest budget items today. First is Medicare and Medicaid. We spend $1.28 trillion on that. Next is Social Security, $1.1 trillion a year. Third is defense spending. And fourth is interest on debt. So it's the cost of our national debt that is already the fourth largest budget item on our annual spending. Guys, these four budget items alone equate to 69% of all US tax revenue. And so the big question becomes, will these expenses go down or will they go up in the coming decades? Well, first and foremost, let's look at that in relation to our aging demographics. So here you can see that the number of Americans over the age of 65 is set to double from 2010 to 2030. And it's no surprise that if tax revenues do not do any sort of increase to be, commensurate with that, it's no surprise that we see Medicare trust insolvency issues being discussed for 4 or 5 years out from today. It's no surprise that we see Social Security trust insolvency issues projected for 2035, 2034. And here's what I want to highlight, is that the next concern, this next changing economic trend is going to exacerbate all of that. So let's talk about inflation. Inflation has spiked to levels not seen since the early 1980s, and that erodes the spending power of your pension, your assets, your incomes altogether. But there's another thing that's going to happen with inflation. Inflation is going to increase the cost of all future Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security benefits. As you can see here, in 2021, Social Security had the largest jump into 2022 at 6.1% since 1980. So what does that mean down the road? It means that those benefits are more expensive moving forward. When we talk about inflation, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US, is tasked with controlling that. They have a dual mandate for monetary policy. Their job is to make sure that there is price stability, that it's not increasing with inflation or decreasing with deflation. And their intention is to also keep us near or at high levels of employment. And so what happens here is they use monetary policy or interest rates as one of the main levers to pull when prices become unstable. So if prices are decreasing like we saw in 2008, what they're going to do is they're going to lower interest rates, make it easier for money to be pumped into the system to keep employment high. But in the reverse situation, when prices become very high, when inflation is running rampant, they are going to tighten monetary policy by increasing the interest rate environment. And as you can see here, we look back at the historical relationship between these two, and you find, the norm here for inflation is under 4 or 5%. But what you'll see here is that in recent history, from the 2008 financial crisis, it was much lower. And as these moved in lockstep, interest rates and inflation suddenly had a divergence here in 2022. So what does that entail? What does that tell us about the Fed's intentions? Well, that they're going to have to raise them. And so now let's bring that back to the existing debt. Our existing debt as a nation is not like what you lock in for your mortgage. Low interest rate environment, you might have gotten a phenomenal deal on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Uncle Sam doesn't have that luxury. It's usually on 2 to 5 year cycles that Uncle Sam's debt comes to term. And so as interest rates increase, the cost of our existing debt will increase as well. And we saw that it was already the 4th largest annual expenditure of our government. So what does this mean for the future? Well, if you look here, you can see that going through the pandemic, building up towards it, and then the cost of our interest went down a little bit in 2020 as interest rates went down. But now we go from the actual to the projected, and what you can see here is that before interest rates were increasing, before inflation forced the Fed's hand in increasing interest rates, the next 10 years we were expecting a $5.4 trillion expense on just the cost of borrowing from future Americans. So what does that mean if interest rates go up? Well, you can see that 10-year cost jumped from 5.4 million to 8.1 million just based on the increases in interest rates through July of 2022. So what do we get for interest? We don't get new schools, new roads, more secure futures. We're paying for the cost of servicing our existing debt, the cost of yesterday's American dream. So as you look forward, what we have to understand is that our interest-only payments are going to be more and more expensive. And you see here that net interest, or the cost of our interest, is the fastest growing of our expenditures. And it is set to outpace or overcome Medicare and Medicaid by 2052. At that time, net interest costs will account for almost 40% of all government revenues. So it's very important that you understand what this means for you. So if we look at increasing expenditures, increasing annual deficits, what you have to ask about is, what will tax revenues need to do to keep up? And in that, you have to be able to understand not just where we are today, but where an aging demographic, where rising interest rates to combat extremely high inflation, and our existing $30 trillion of debt have gotten us, but furthermore where they are going to take us in the future. And here you can see the projection of our national debt to GDP growing from 100% to 202% over the next 20 to 30 years. So this is extremely critical because it is an indicator to us of what future tax rates will look like. Here you can see debt to GDP in blue. You can see the national debt building up in green, and our tax rates, the top tax bracket, in gray. And you can see that as our national debt had to come down from the end of World War II, it was by having an increase in taxation for much of the next 40 years and then seeing a similar line, a similar trend. As our national debt came in line, so too did the top tax bracket fall. But now you look forward, how far into the future can we spend on this trajectory while raising tax revenues on this trajectory? Especially when we have a $30 trillion hole to dig our way out of to begin with. So with that said, it is important that you defend your retirement from the IRS potentially looking to take a much bigger chunk or much bigger bite out of your retirement.